Morning. Thank you everyone for attending. John, would you like to start the webinar?
Sure, thanks Liz. And welcome everyone and thanks for joining today's webinar. We're looking forward to sharing some of the exciting activities that are taking place in the Mara River Basin, which is a globally significant transboundary basin shared between Kenya and Tanzania. We're going to discuss some innovative approaches, institutional frameworks for water governance, and decision support tools that are improving water security and transboundary cooperation in the Mara. So water security and transboundary cooperation around water are issues that are of significant interest to the work of the Sustainable Water Partnership, and they're also key themes within the new USG Global Water Strategy. Stakeholders in the Mara have led some really groundbreaking efforts in these areas. It's our hope today and in the future that some of the experiences and lessons in the Mara can be applied as a learning opportunity and model for other transboundary basins that face similar issues and are grappling with similar decisions on how to cooperate and allocate scarce water across borders and competing demands. So before we get into the presentation, I want to give a very quick overview of the Sustainable Water Partnership. SWP, it's a Leader with Associates. It's a global activity funded by USAID Washington with potential for USAID mission buy-ins. And we focus on working with stakeholders to address the key risks and threats that are facing water around the world. It's led by Winrock International with consortium partners that include Tetra Tech, Stockholm Environment Institute, IUCN, World Resources Institute, CEO Water, Mandate, and M-Water. So SWP has a number of ongoing field-based activities around the world, as well as broader analytical work focused on water security. But today we're going to focus on one of our on-the-ground activities, which is underway in the Mara. And for our work in the Mara, in addition to the SWP consortium, I'd like to note that IHE Delft is also one of our key partners and is providing technical expertise on water allocation planning. And we're also developing broader partnerships with WWF and GIZ, among others, to really build on and expand all the great efforts that are underway. So I have the privilege today of being joined by Omari Mwinjaka, who's the Water Resources Officer at the Lake Victoria Basin Commission, who's our main institutional partner for this activity, as well as Gordon Mumbo, team leader of SWP Sustainable Water for the Mara activity. And before handing it over to Omari, I want to quickly walk everyone through the outline for our presentation today. So we're going to start with the bigger regional picture and broader institutional context for transboundary water resources in the East African community. We're going to describe how this institutional and governance framework has provided a strong enabling environment for transboundary cooperation in the Mara River Basin. This is going to be followed by an overview of some of the key water security risks and challenges facing the Mara, along with opportunities. We're then going to discuss some specific management instruments that are now in place that support transboundary cooperation on water in the Mara, focusing particularly on the MOU for joint management of water resources in the Mara, which is recently signed by the governments of Kenya and Tanzania. And finally, we're going to present some key approaches and tools that are being implemented under SWP Sustainable Water for the Mara activity, specifically some innovative efforts to carry out water allocation planning, decision support tools to improve water decision-making, stakeholder engagement, as well as on-the-ground actions to improve water security, and efforts to improve transboundary governance in the context of the MOU. We're going to reserve about 15 to 20 minutes at the end to wrap up with questions and discussion. So now I'm going to hand it over to Omari, who is based in Kisumu, Kenya, along with Gordon Mumbo. Omari.
Thank you, John. Hi, participants. Yeah, thank you. The Victoria Basin Commission is a specialized institution of the East African community that is responsible for coordinating various activities for the sustainable development of the Lake Victoria. The countries have designated Lake Victoria Basin as an area of high economic interest and hence a regional economic growth zone by all the 5 countries. The basin is established based on the protocol for Sustainable Development of Lake Victoria Basin Commission, but he also is provided by the treaty that establishes the East African Community. And one of the mandates provided by the protocol, but also the treaty, is to oversee the implementation of various memorandum of understanding. In this particular time, I will talk about MOU for the Mara Transboundary River Basin. Within the East African Community, there are a number of aquatic and also terrestrial ecosystems. For the aquatic ecosystems, we have the Lake Victoria Basin Commission, Lake Victoria Basin, which is shared by the 5 countries. We have the Kagera River Basin shared by the 4 countries. We have the Mara River Basin, which is our focus today, shared between Kenya and Tanzania. We also have the Sio Malaba Malakisi, which is shared between Kenya and Uganda, and Chala Jipe, which is shared between Kenya and Tanzania. We also have a number of terrestrial ecosystems. We have the Mount Elgon ecosystems, which is shared between Kenya and Uganda. The Great Serengeti Maasai Mara ecosystem between Tanzania and Kenya. Minziro Sango Bay swamp between Uganda and Tanzania. And Nyungwe Kibera National Park between Rwanda and Burundi. So what is the importance of transboundary? Within the East African Community, the treaty, but also the protocol, the economies of these East African countries depends so much on the goods and services provided by the transboundary natural resources, particularly water. And of course, the EAC integration and the stability is linked to the transboundary water resource management and improve cooperation and reduce competition and conflicts among the countries. You can see in the picture on the right, the lake is the only major transboundary area that join all the 5 countries of Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, but the basin is also spread into Rwanda and Burundi. Next slide. Yeah, the Mara River, as I mentioned, is shared between Kenya and Tanzania, and 65% of the Mara River Basin is in the Kenyan side and 5% is in Tanzanian side. It covers around 13.3 square kilometers and 400 kilometers long. That's the river. In the census of 2002, the population was about 1.1 million. And of course, the economical and livelihood activities includes tourism, livestock, agriculture, mining, as well as water for people, households, and also the ecosystem benefits. Mara Transboundary River is very, very important locally, regionally, but also it has a lot of global significance. It's one of the 7th natural wonder of the world, renewed by UNESCO heritage, because it housed the Maasai Mara Serengeti ecosystem. On the top right picture, that is the Mau forest, the water tower where the Mara River starts. But it's also very, very important in terms of a global conservation significance, especially in the economies of Kenya and Tanzania, in terms of tourism, because the tourism sector contribute about 20% of the total budget of these 2 countries. Most importantly, it also contributes flow to the downstream countries of the Nile, and also it contributes quite amount of water to downstream countries of the Nile Basin. Next slide. Apart from the importance to these 2 countries, but there are also a number of threats and risks that are affecting the water quality, but also quantity within the Mara River Basin. We have a lot of population growth and expanding urban centers. We have so much land use changes. The land is used in different ways. You can see on the right side of the picture, the gold mining activities ongoing, but also increasing food and energy demand to most people within the basin. Threats to sustainable supply of good water quality because of the various activities ongoing unsustainable land management, mining activities. We have a lot of challenges in terms of having a good quality of water. But again, the climate change has also impacted a lot of activities and livelihood within the basin. Next slide. Yeah, as I mentioned, if you can see in these particular slides, we have the upper catchment where the Mara River starts. That's the Mau Forest in Kenya, and further downstream in Tanzania on the lower shade where the river enters into the Lake Victoria. There are a number of challenges, as I mentioned, the main causes, but also main impacts. So we have deforestation, unsustainable farming practices, riverbank encroachment, urban development, mining activities, overgrazing and deforestation, wetland encroachment, and burning plus farming. But again, we also have a lot of impacts within the basin. That is, of course, the change of climate. We have flow regimes, water storage, where we have sometimes very, very low water flowing in the river. We have erosion and loss of fertile soil, sediment loading and silting, water pollution, as I shown in the picture before, water scarcity, land degradation and erosion. Nowadays, a lot of spread of invasive species and weeds, but also wetland degradation and expansion. So these are some of the main causes and the main impact within the basin from the upper catchment to lower catchment within the Tanzanian side. Next slide. So what has happened after all these challenges? The two countries decided to sit together and decide on how they could move way forward in terms of their collaboration. Before the signing of MOU, there have been a number of established institutions. We had Mara Transboundary Water Users Associations. We had environmental natural resources associations, hoteliers forums, where the two countries within these particular committees, countries could move and make some final, concrete decision for water resources management. But the country went further in 2015, where after a long time preparation of the MOU, of which the two countries showed the importance of sharing these particular resources, signed the MOU in 2015 in Tanzania. If you can see on the right picture, you can see the Minister of Water of Kenya. We have the permanent secretaries of Tanzania, but also overseen by the Vice President of United Republic of Tanzania, far right with the glasses. So you can see the importance of this particular MOU. So the MOU have established a joint management committee, and which comprise of the joint steering committee. This is the second in command of the ministries responsible for water and environment. These are the permanent secretaries. But you also have the joint technical committees, which is formed by the directors from the ministries responsible for water and environment. But you also have the technical experts who are forming the joint implementation committee. Of course, based on this MOU, we also had the delegation from the Mara Joint Management Committee visiting the Okavango Basin to see the best practices that have been implemented within the Okavango Basin. And of course, there are a number of key agreed activities that were formed or overseen from the Okavango, which will further improve the management of water resources within the Mara Basin. Next slide. So the MOU provide a number of key articles that guides its implementation. Article 2 sets out the objectives of the Memorandum of Understanding between the two countries. Article 3 sets the scope of interventions. Article 4 sets out the governance structure, joint management committee, joint steering committee, joint technical committee, and joint implementation committee. And Article 9, it gives Lake Victoria Basin Commission the mandates to mobilize resource, but also implement the memorandum of understanding. I would like to hand over now to my colleague, Gordon Mumbo, to give a brief on the activities implemented by Sustainable Water Partnership Program. Thank you.
Thank you, Omari, and good afternoon and good morning, participants, wherever you are. Omari has given us a background on the importance the two countries attaches to the Mara River Basin in terms of economically and socially. So the sustainable water for the Mara activity is supposed to support the implementation of that MOU. And this is a 3-year activity that will support the implementation of the AU with the objective of safeguarding adequate water for social and economic and livelihoods of the riparians around the basin and the sustenance of the ecosystem. About 4 results are expected to be realized during these 3 years of implementing this activity. One, as mentioned previously, the MOU has been set, the governance structure is in place. This activity is going to support the governance structure of the basin to have decision support tools that will help them in making decisions in relation to the management of the basin, the utilization of water, giving a better understanding of the status of the river at any time. The second result that will be realized during this period of implementation is greater awareness of stakeholders. We have various stakeholders in the basin. We have the water users who use water for agriculture. And as you know, the Mara transpasses two great protected areas, which is Maasai Mara Game Park in the Mara on the Kenyan side and Serengeti on the Tanzania side. That receives a lot of visitors. So we have a lot of hoteliers there who use water. We have communities who live along the basin. We deepen their understanding on the issues affecting the basin so that they can be part and parcel of the management of the process. In addition to that, we need to get onto the ground and assess some of the practices currently done at subcatchment levels, which are not contribute bad health to the river. And we'll be working with communities on the ground to do assessments and come to an understanding on some of the conservation measures that need to be put in place to sustain and conserve the waters in the Mara. That is what we are calling on the ground water security actions. And the last one is the management structure. The MOU has spelled out the governance structure and institutions that are responsible for the management of the Mara River. But we need now to go deeper and define the roles and responsibilities and decision-making levels of these governance structures that have been established. Next slide, please. Yes, if we go into the decision support tools, one of the critical one is the water allocation planning, getting an understanding on how much water is available in the river system, how much is needed for sustenance of the environment, which we are calling reserve flow in the river, and how much can we abstract in a sustainable way to support the ecosystem and the communities around there. A similar plan has been developed on the Kenyan side, but since this is a transboundary river, the process cannot be completed without developing water allocation planning on the downstream side, which is Tanzania. So this activity is going to support the development of water allocation plan on the Tanzania side, which is on the lower side of the river, Once this is done and brought to the level where initial activities have reached in Kenya, then we'll come together as parties, experts in Kenya and Tanzania, and sit together and come up with a transboundary water allocation plan. Once the transboundary water allocation plan is in place, it will give the governance structure of the Mara Basin better positions in making decisions on how they want to utilize the water, either for industry, production, and what is required for domestic use. Next slide, please. Yes, another very important tool which we are going to develop in terms of modeling the river is the WEEP, Water Evaluation and Planning Tool, which has been ably developed by one of our partners in the consortium, Stockholm Environmental Institute. WEEP has been used quite a lot in Africa and in the United States in modeling rivers. So we are going to look at every tributary that contributes water to the Mara and model it and come up with different scenarios. Using the WEEP tool, it will help us to answer questions like, what happens if the demand of the water increases to an extent that what is available cannot sustain it? This tool will be able to give the management within the Mara Basin on how to either reallocate water to the users on how to do it. If the amount of water increases, what do we do? If due to climate vulnerability, things changes and we don't have enough flow, and we still want to maintain the ecosystem. So this will be an important tool in answering if questions in different scenario situations. So the WEEP model will also be developed for Mara. Quite a bit of modeling has been done on the Kenyan side, and the similar is going to be done on the Tanzanian side. So we'll have a better understanding of every part of the river using the WEEP system. Next slide. Yeah, the other important element is the stakeholders engagement. Actually, the river belongs to the people. And we want to bring the people together in terms of understanding the water security issues that affect the river, in terms of enhancing their capacity on the understanding, explaining to them to the different situations, and also giving them a basic understanding of the tools, especially the allocation planning process, such that when the water regulators say at this point, no abstraction is going to be done, they would understand why that needs to be done to conserve the river. We are also looking at human relations. People in Kenya and Tanzania who share the river should really understand one another and be given the same level of information on the river itself. And you can see in the photos, the photo on the left is more of a session of dissemination information for the WAP development in Kenya. And the photo in the right is really the Foreign Affairs Minister in Kenya at that time, and the Foreign Affairs Minister in Tanzania. So we are looking at relationship management right at national level, down to the basin level, and down to the subcatchment level, so that people have better relations and a better understanding on the utilization of the river. Next slide. Yes, on the ground activities, we sometimes in February, we had a meeting with all our stakeholders, and the main question was to we discussed identification of some of the water security issues that are currently existing in the basin. And some of the issues they came up with was about catchment management. And this catchment management, we are going to take it down right onto the ground. The meeting also identified that livelihood diversification would be necessary because there's some livelihood practices that especially people who cut down trees to burn charcoal for a livelihood, people who do degradation in the wetlands, especially in the brick making. If alternative livelihoods could be identified and diversified to discourage these negative practices to the health of the river. We are also looking, people need to drink water. In terms of access to water, what is happening at the moment, and they say the wash elements is also a critical one. There are bylaws in both Kenya and Tanzania that safeguard the utilization and the management of rivers. But currently, these are probably not understood well, or the people who are supposed to disseminate this information are so few. So this activity will support the process of enlightening people on the compliance issues and working with local organizations to ensure that people understand the bylaws regarding river basin management aspects and this enforcement procedures. The other element is resource mobilization that was identified in our meeting. The resource mobilization, we are not on this alone. We are working with other partners in the process who have had some work experience in the Mara, like WWF, BirdLife in the wetlands, and some other organizations who are providing intervention in the Mara Basin. We'll be working with them. We also discussed the possibility of how can some of the money paid by the obstructors be plowed back into catchment conservation. These are policy issues that we'll be also exploring with the governments of the two countries, Kenya and Tanzania. Next slide. Yes, if we talk about transboundary governance, when Omari took us through the slides, the governance structure on the Mara River Basin has been identified, but still their roles and responsibilities are not very clear. So this activity is we are going to work to clarify the roles and responsibilities and levels of decision-making processes. And the photos there show you one of the meetings that we had and one meeting at community level, basically having a discussion. So we are looking at transboundary level where we get the structures from Kenya and Tanzania coming together and agreeing and defining their roles clearly on what they will be playing in the management of the Mara Basin. At the regional level, we also want to strengthen the boards and the water users associations so that they can be managers of the basin with a better understanding on what is existing. At sub-catchment levels, we are looking at the water users, and in both Kenya and Tanzania, there are water user associations. These associations have not been strong before, but with the signing of this MOU, it has given them more of a legal standing that any action they will be taking in the basin will be backed by the articles in the MOU. But the key factor is that we want them to be functional and be responsible in terms of management of the basin issues. Next slide, please. Oh, that brings us to the end of the presentation, and we now encourage you to get into a session of questions and discussions. Any areas that you need clarification, we will be willing to help answer to the best of our ability. Thank you.
You can submit questions in the chat box, but since I have the unique opportunity of being in charge of all of this, I'm going to start off with my question. I would be very interested in knowing what you are doing to engage the ecotourism sector in the whole Mara region, because I know that that is a great deal of livelihood comes from those people.
Okay, what has happened is we've started the formation of Hoteliers Association, especially the tourist destinations in the Mara, both in Kenya and Tanzania, and we'll facilitate them to get registered. And once they are registered, they can agree among themselves in terms of water use and how they could support the process in sustaining the river. So the Hoteliers Association establishment is in the process. This is one way we would like to handle the tourism aspect activity in the Mara Basin. Not only hotels, but there are also some camps and tour companies that we would like to join this association so that the management of the Mara is inclusive as possible.
Thank you for that, Gordon. We also have another question about just the difficulties of communicating, especially over transboundary areas. Could you speak a little bit about what you're doing to improve communication or what you have planned? Thank you.
Yeah, my colleague Omari will give it a go, then we'll see.
Thank you, Mumbo. For us as the Lake Victoria Basin Commission, that's one of our major role in terms of ensuring countries work together. As I gave my presentation, we are now very much experienced in this supporting countries. I give an example. We have Chala Umbajipe in Kenya and Tanzania. Some of these transboundary, they are out of the basins, and actually the countries, they feel very much free and very confident with the Lake Victoria Basin Commission in terms of bringing them together, sitting them together, formation some of these MOUs. So for the Mara River, based on our experiences and also guided by the protocol, but also the treaty, we are able to bring the countries together because they have confidence in Lake Victoria Basin Commission being a neutral organizations, which really supports the countries in terms of management of these transboundary basins. Thank you.
John, did you want to mention anything? You've been kind of quiet.
Are there any more questions that we've received, Liz? Or
It looks like we just got one in.
okay.
And it says, "Hi, thank you for organizing the webinar. There are two questions. To USAID, how do you identify the Mara Basin to support among all the transboundary basins? And at this point, how did you identify the actual focus for assisting the cooperation process? So how did this project come to be?"
So I can start with that, and then Gordon and Omari, feel free to add anything that I may have missed. So the genesis of this was, as I mentioned, SWP has a number of field-based activities, and the process during our first year was to examine potential sites and basins where water security issues are very significant, and also where there's an enabling environment that provides some conditions for success. In the Mara was identified for a number of different reasons. We talked a little bit about the growing threats that are affecting water availability and quality in the basin. So it's definitely a basin that is under stress. We've talked about the sort of governance framework and institutional environment that allows SWP and stakeholders to really engage in a sort of bottom-up, stakeholder-driven process to improve water security, and that was another key factor for why we focused in on the Mara. And then another important factor was that there were quite a bit of previous USAID investments that provided SWP some real opportunities to build on the results that were achieved in those activities. So one of the earlier transboundary activities was under a previous leader with Associates water resources project called GLOWS that really sort of laid some of the sort of conditions and framework for the work that we're building on. There was work under USAID Kenya's Pro-Mara activity that worked in the Mau Forest and the water towers. And another regional project that has just wrapped up called Prepared, which worked with the Lake Victoria Basin Commission, focusing on the basin as a whole, but also there was a lot of work in the Mara. And so these things really gave us an opportunity to build on a lot of what has already been done and sort of take it to the next level with the limited resources that we have. So those were the key factors that made us as SWP want to focus in on the Mara.
I've gotten a bunch more questions, so can I follow up with the second one? The second part of this question is that this is directed towards local stakeholders. The title of the seminar involves conflict, yet I do not recall this being mentioned so far. I appreciate that it was mentioned that TWC is a process. So did it include actual cases of conflict, or did you manage to avoid them? Could you reflect on this, especially the choke points you see on the ground among all the threats that you have mentioned?
Well, I could give it a go and my colleagues could add. Of course, there are normally conflicts when it comes to the use of water, where particularly in the Mara, where we have people who are agriculturalists, we have people who keep livestock. So there are normally disagreements about who has the right to use the water. So these are there. That's why we are talking of building a relationship among the communities and even at national level of the people there. And particularly if we have an understanding on the available water and how it can be utilized, how it has been allocated. These are the areas where we think the scientific tools will really help us, and especially the dissemination process that we are planning in the activity, where every aspect will be explained to the people. We see this as some of the ways of mitigating conflict, especially about the water use. And there are always mistrust among upstream and downstream people. That's why we are working closely with both of them to make transboundary arrangements where information is shared freely among the upstream and the downstream populations. You want to add something?
Just to add from my colleague Gordon, actually, I think if you read so many articles for the Mara River, there are some, if not addressed, some of the conflicts which may rise to challenges between the two countries. Recently, for example, there are some rumors on the development of the dams on the Kenyan side of the Mara Transboundary. But also, the countries also received some complaints from UNESCO on the Serengeti heritage site, on the same concern on the Kenyan side. So this particular program, especially the water allocation plan, will help the two countries. And of course, as we mentioned, some of the highest body within the countries, that is the permanent secretaries, have sat down and agreed that this water allocation plan is a priority for the future management of the transboundary, so that the countries become informed on whatever developments need to take place in one country to another. So this is some of the conflicts which we want to address before they come to the reaching at a level where addressing them become challenging. Thank you.
Okay, I have another question, and it asks, can you talk more about the process for engaging people or stakeholders in the process of prioritizing and implementing local actions to improve water security?
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. I think we are involving our approach is really bottom up in terms of going to the people and discussing with them the issues and coming up with options. I mentioned that even before we categorized areas of intervention, we called the stakeholders together and talked with them to discuss issues. In addition to that, there are catchment management plans that have been done in both the areas where we're going to work, particularly in Nyangores and the wetlands. So what we are doing at the moment is going back to the communities and sitting with them and validating some of the conservation measures that have come in these catchment management plans. And if they agree the situation has changed, what has become more critical priority for them in the areas of conservation, we see that. So we are not deciding the process on our own, but looking at any documentation on catchment management plans that have been developed. There are quite a number that have been developed for the basin. But what we are doing now is going back at community level, with sub-catchment level, and discussing with them and setting up priorities. So the areas of conservations that were identified in our strategic planning meeting with stakeholders, we'll still take them further to community level for validation before actual actions are taken. Thank you.
Just to really quickly add one thing that Gordon you mentioned, but to highlight that the decision support tools and the process that we're carrying out with both the water allocation planning as well as the WEEP modeling is intended to help work with stakeholders to really inform the selection of which particular interventions work best both now and in the future, what we call robust decisions. And as Gordon mentioned, there are plans in place in our two focal subcatchments, the Nyangores and the Mara wetlands. There's a subcatchment management plan in Nyangores and an integrated wetlands management plan in the Mara wetlands. So we'll be working with stakeholders to identify and using our analytical tools to help define which interventions are really the most feasible and sort of the no regrets measures. Thanks.
There's also a very interesting follow-on question that is kind of related, and that is what are some of the most surprising collaborations that you've seen in the region, or some interesting partnering that this organization is looking to achieve? Someone could speak to that.
Okay. In fact, the key factor, the most interesting collaboration we've seen is the signing of the MOU between the two countries. And the other element is for the two countries accepting that they need a water allocation plan to strengthen their collaboration in managing the basin. I've experienced from other basins, but most of the time you find people are reluctant to get into the route of water allocation plan. Actually, many basins do jump into notification processes without developing a water allocation plan. So to us, this is very interesting and very encouraging, making the work in the Mara quite exciting, and it goes deep to prove the commitments of the two countries to manage their basin. There are other NGOs that we'll be collaborating with in this process. I mentioned WWF as one of the organizations that has also worked significantly in the Mara for many years. There are also government initiatives in the Mara. I also mentioned Birds Life, who have spent quite substantial time in the wetlands in Tanzania, and many other organizations, that the water use associations who are also interested. There are also other NGOs that are intervening in the wash sector, and all of them will be our collaborators. Besides that, there are also other institutions like the Nile Basin Initiative, which has its equatorial lakes subsidiary action plan also working in the Mara Basin. All these institutions will strive to work together with them for better realization of the objectives of this activity. Thank you.
Gordon, do you want to quickly mention some of the private sector interests in collaboration, for example, BASF and others, which are very interesting potential collaborations?
Yes, I could mention BASF, which we are already in discussions. BASF manufacture the ingredients that is used in the manufacture of detergents that are used by hoteliers. But we are collaborating, working with them, currently actually developing a memorandum of understanding where we will go and assess what kind of detergents the hoteliers use and what is the quality of water that they are discharging back into the river. And the BSS is willing to sponsor the process. We are also looking the hoteliers as a private sector who should participate also in the management and sustenance of the Mara Basin. We are also looking at people who abstract water in the private sector for irrigation and what kind of contributions they make. We want to get a better understanding on if they're using any pesticides, what happens to them, what kind of runoff get out of their farm. So I would say the Mara activity is really inclusive. We're bringing the private sector, we're bringing other institutions, government and non-governmental institutions. Thank you, John, for raising that.
Okay, in our last minutes here, there have actually been several questions that are just about the sustainability of the project and what is the project going to do to ensure that it goes on or that exists beyond donor funding?
Yeah, I think that is a critical element of any development. And that's why there are also already institutions that have been identified in the MOU in terms of the governance structure. These institutions are funded by the governments because they're composed of government senior employees. And if you go on the ground, we are talking of the water use associations that would help in terms of enforcement. These water use associations are riparian populations who will be there all the time. And as I mentioned, in terms of their sustenance, there are policy issues that we'll be discussing with governments on how can the fees paid by abstractors be plowed back to support this water users association to keep them running beyond the project's life. So these are some of the policy issues that we'll be addressing to ensure the sustainability of the project. But in terms of management structure, Lake Victoria Basin Commission is a structure that has been established under the East African Community and will continue to exist beyond the support of this project. And since they are our main institutional partner, definitely they will move on with the activities of this project. Omari, do you want to add?
Just add on that. This program is one of the key areas of cooperation for the Lake Victoria Basin Commission. And I forgot to mention our management structure. Our management structure comprises of the summit, that is the heads of states, which meet twice in a year. We also have the Council of Ministers of all the countries. We also have the Sectoral Council of Ministers, which provide guidance and also directive on the management of various activities in the basin. So this particular program, as Gordon mentioned, it is started very well because of the countries' participations of various stakeholders within the countries. These include the policymakers, which are the permanent secretaries, but also it goes up to the Sectoral Council of Ministers for further decisions. And most of these activities will be mainstreamed in the development plans of the countries, because it goes to our highest level of the ministerial sessions, where the ministers always requires that there are relevant ministries responsible for this particular initiative is including it into their national development plans and also budgets. So the sustainability of this particular program, because it's within the processes or the governance structure of the East African Community Lake Victoria Basin Commission, the sustainability of most of these activities will be ensured because it's the process it follows our management structure, but also guidelines within the commission. Thank you.
Just really quickly, there's one other thing to add just to highlight this is that, that sustainability has been a really critical element of the design of this activity. And we have fully embedded all of our activities within institutions that have the mandate and the responsibility for management and governance in the Mara, so that they really have ownership of this activity, and that everything we do reflects what their priorities are and the demands of the stakeholders in the region. So it has been something that has been built in at the outset of the project.
Okay, well, I think that that's actually a good stopping point for today. But of course, there are some more questions, and we will hopefully be able to get back to people about those individually in emails. We're going to make a recording of this webinar available on our website, and we'll send it out to all attendees. And feel free to request copies of the PowerPoint presentation if you so desire. Thank you very much for attending, and everybody have a good rest of the day. And thank you to our speakers, John, Omari, and Gordon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.